Today we're going to talk about a very interesting principle called the 80-20 rule. I love the 80-20 rule because it's really a universal type of principle that just happens to also apply to design. And we're going to see how that happens. So the 80-20 rule tells us that a high percentage of effects in a large system are normally caused by a low percentage of variables. This is also known, by the way, as the Pareto principle, named after Italian economist and philosopher Vilfredo Pareto, who noticed this back in the end of the 19th century. And the observation for Pareto started off by actually looking at the distribution of land in Italy. And Pareto noticed that roughly 80% of the land in Italy belonged to 20% of the people. And he investigated further on how this law actually applied in many other areas. And of course, many researchers since the end of the 19th century have expanded this concept. And now we know that the Pareto principle, or the 80-20 rule, applies in a variety of scenarios, almost every single domain or system that you can think of. There's a strong likelihood that this principle will apply. And these are just a few examples, right? So 20% of the population generates 80% of the income. 20% of customers account for 80% of total profits. 20% of a company's products represent 80% of sales. If you are involved in startups and companies, you probably know that rings a bell, and it's very likely true, right? You can think of companies as large as Apple, right? Not all products sell the same, right? So there's a subset of products that accounts for a large majority of the revenue of the sales. Also, another example, 20% of blog posts generate 80% of traffic. If you happen to be a blogger, you know that very much the case. Only a handful of your blog posts are actually bringing a lot of people in, right? And finally, one that we can all relate, 80% of the time is spent on 20% of the apps. And I'm sure you probably know what those 20% of apps are on your mobile phone. And this is also why some people call this the vital few, right? The vital few being that 20% of the population, the 20% of a company's products, the 20% of blog posts. Those are normally called the vital few because they are really sustaining the entire system on its own. And another highlight from the 80-20 rule tells us that 80% of results will come from just 20% of the action. And you could even apply this to your own personal life and to your own personal efforts as well. So maybe the question that you are wondering by now is, how does this apply to design and user experience, right? After all, we are talking about design principles. So it applies in this particular way. 80% of a product's usage involves 20% of its features. And again, the percentage is not exact, right? It could be 7-30, 75-25, 90-10. Even in the previous examples that we went over, the percentage is not always matching, of course, 80% and 20% precisely, right? It's just a rough sort of estimate to that distribution. But this actually is a very interesting insight for user experience and design in general. When you think about, and the first question that should come to mind is like, that's interesting. So what are those 20%, right? It seems like I should really be investing in those 20% of features. Because again, they are the vital few sustaining the product, the vital few sustaining the system. And the 80-20 rule has been applied in UI even without you noticing that it was there, right? It goes all the way back to the early interfaces by Windows, for example. This is an old interface, an old UI for Word, the Word document interface. And notice how the most prominent features, the ones that people use the most, they are featured a lot more prominently in the UI, right? They have its own dedicated icon. They are just one click away. Things like the save, change the font, what else? Print and other functions, changing the zooming, right? These are functions that users use the most. Those are the 20%, and they are, again, highly prominent in the user interface. The ones that fall into the long tail, there are secondary and tertiary features. They fall into a series of pull downs that we are all used to seeing in a variety of different types of applications and software. The same thing, again, you can apply to interfaces that you use on a daily basis. This is Gmail, right? If you go to Gmail, this is a bit of an outdated screen grab, but you get a sense of the same idea, the same principle in action. So look at the two most prominent actions in that space, in this environment. It's the compose, right? You couldn't miss it even if you tried, by the location, the size, and the color, right? It's really, really calling your attention. And search at the very top in blue, also very prominent due to the color and placement. So those probably comprise the 20% of features in this UI, at least the things that people click the most and use the most. The rest, again, that falls into the long tail, they go into pull downs, either for settings or more actions pertaining to messages. And of course, you also see this in the vast majority of mobile apps that you have on your phone. Normally, those little 5 or 4 icons that you have on an app that normally sit on the bottom of the screen, those are very likely to be the 20% of the features, right? Again, the things that users use the most, right? And everything that falls out of that sense of priority goes into what they call the burger menu. And the burger menu actually gets a lot of bad reputation. I think it actually could work when designed properly. But the interesting thing about the burger menu is that it's almost like your kitchen sink, right? It's like everything that goes under your mat when you are trying to clean your house in a really fast manner. And you have a miscellaneous amount of features there. But they, of course, they are inside, they are under the mat, right, in your kitchen sink, because they are not the priority. At least we would hope that that's not the case. So the burger menu serves that functionality of encompassing all these secondary features. The same can be said for data visualization, right? Specifically in an area of data visualization that we call data analytics or data exploration, that we basically create fairly complex environments, very complex dashboards for people to investigate and explore data at their own pace, right? And in those cases, you tend to have a lot of different controls, UI pull downs, options to select, and so on. So the same principle applies here, right? In terms of finding out the 20% of features that users use the most and prioritize them. So the good question is, how do you find your 20%? And again, I'm halfway through this, but if you do actually have questions pertaining to this and other related topics, please use the Ask a Question module at the bottom of the screen. So how do you find your 20%, right? You have a product, how can I actually go about doing that? So my first recommendation is to actually map your system, okay? You have to do this you should have done this in many ways before you actually started planning for your product. But at some point, you need to have a solid understanding of the architecture of your system, of your product. And of course, there's different tools that you can do pertaining to information architecture. I tend to love these 2.5D called isometric views of a system. I find, of course, also because my background and experience in data visualization, I find these specific representations to be very effective. But you could use any type of scheme or diagram to convey the architecture of your product, right? So that would be step number 1. Then you have to rely on 2 strong tools. One of them is, of course, quantitative metrics. They are also called analytics for your product, right? They basically provide an understanding of the overall usage and traffic patterns within your product. Super, super important, right? But also, not less important, is qualitative research. And this is where you actually get to sit down with real users face to face in a pre-COVID way, now probably over online on chat. And you get to meet and talk directly with your customers, with your users, to better understand and assess their needs. And unfortunately, in many companies, if any of these things actually exist, they tend to be in separate teams, in separate groups, which is very detrimental to the overall product understanding. Why is that the case, you may ask? Well, let me show you just a quick example. So let's say that you are a designer, and again, you invest hardly in trying to map out the system to have a really solid understanding of the architecture for your product. And then you talk to the analytics team, and they actually find out that the architecture is working to a certain degree, in the sense that the most visited pages or sections or features of your product are, the first one are the highest up in the hierarchy, right? So it's working well to a certain degree. They are easy to find, easy to navigate, and people don't seem to be having any issue finding those features. But then when you actually talk to user researchers who are actually on the field talking and observing real customers, you have the insight that, in fact, two of the features that they love the most or are most useful to them, to their specific needs, are in fact fairly hidden within the architecture. They are 3 or 4 steps away, clicks away from what they are actually trying to achieve. So this is by far a problem, okay? And this is, of course, why these two fields should be really talking to each other and really integrated, seamlessly integrated as part of the product team. Well, one of the best ways for you to do that is by investing in critical user journeys. This is actually, user journeys is a broad term, but at Google, we actually call this critical user journeys. And these are really important. This is really a layer that sits on top of the architecture and tries to map out every single journey, every path that a user makes within that product, within that system, okay? So if you want to do that, now you have a much better understanding how, in order to achieve that specific feature that user research uncovered and bring it up to front, that's the challenge, right? You can measure this path. You can understand that you actually have 4 steps kind of blocking you to get there, like steps away, which is definitely an issue from a discoverability standpoint, from a findability standpoint. And the goal now that you have uncovered this critical user journey is to minimize the number of steps, right? Sometimes you don't necessarily need to put it at the very high level of the hierarchy of the product per se, but you need to minimize friction, right? You need to make that task as seamless as possible and land users where they need the most as soon as possible, right? So this, of course, expands in many other areas, critical user journeys. You can actually measure the efficiency of along the way in every single step. And this could even be a tracking mechanism for you and your team, right? To basically attempt to do a better path for the user. You can measure the success rate along the way in every single step and try to, let's say, quarter after quarter, or even in a given period of time, every 2 weeks, attempt to improve that in a way that, again, you maximize traffic to the feature that is required and needed most by the users. So this would be a way of discovering your 20%, right? The vital few that are essential in sustaining your product and sustaining your system. And finally, I will leave you with a quote. This is a quote that, of course, is very much in line with the 80-20 rule, but it's something that you can really apply to your own personal life. Strive for excellence in few things rather than good performance in many. That's a good food for thought for today's session. So a few other principles to consider related to the 80-20 rule are, of course, the whole notion of hierarchy. It's definitely a fundamental principle for design in general, for graphic design, and also, of course, for user experience. Progressive disclosure is another really important principle. There's actually we did a session already on this. It's available on YouTube, so if you want to explore that. And direct manipulation. Maybe a future session would be on this also very important principle for interaction design. And again, I normally like to end with this. I like to say this is actually my favorite Wikipedia page, and I'm not lying. I know it's a little bit geeky, but it is true. It's a delight of it has this really remarkable list of human biases, cognitive biases, and many of them can easily be converted into design principles. So if you are interested in better understanding the human brain, some of its fallacies and biases and tendencies, this is the page for you. Thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate it. If you want to follow me on Twitter or on LinkedIn, this is the way to do it. This is also where I post updates on forthcoming webinars, interviews, and things of that nature. So if you don't follow me there already, maybe you should, if you want to be informed of future sessions like this one. I'm also here on crowdcast.io/MSLima. I've tried a few webinar platforms. This is the one that I like the most for different reasons that I can expand maybe at another time. But if you don't follow me here, you should. You can use the little green button at the very top of this interface that says follow, and you can just follow me here on Crowdcast. So as soon as a new webinar comes up in the future, you will be notified straight away. So thanks again so much for your time. And now we open the floor for questions. And I'm going to start using the ask a question in this little interface here. Let me just maximize my screen as well. All right, so we have a question by Natalie Jones. Great, Natalie, good to see you. Natalie's been one of the few that has been here with us for quite some time. The question is, have there been any kind of mathematical exploration of the 80-20 rule? Any reason behind it, cognitive, psychological, etc.? There is some explanation. I don't really know the whole story behind it. If you actually follow there's of course a Wikipedia page on the 80-20 rule. There's many articles written on the 80-20 rule. I think a lot of it stems from systems theory, right? And this prevalence of this distribution. And again, it's not always 80-20 necessarily. Sometimes it's 7-30, and then countless examples. Actually, the Wikipedia page contains multiple examples on software, for example, the number of bugs that they find, the number of lines of code that they find. It's a really impressive. There's really no one single solid explanation as to why that is the case, but the vital few is something that we see everywhere, both in human systems, man-made systems, and in natural systems as well. So it's a really interesting phenomenon, and it pertains probably to systems theory in certain extent, to the behavior of complex systems. So it's something to investigate further, I'm sure. So, great. So another question from Kuhu Gupta, who asks, are there any examples of using 80-20 rule in data visualization? I think, again, it's the same principle applies in if you are doing an interface of some sort. If you are doing a single chart, it's not as likely that this law will apply. If you're doing like just a simple line chart with one single metric, it will not apply. But if you're doing something a little bit more complex that involves a set of options, right, a set of controls, maybe some pull downs, maybe a few things to select, a few criteria, right, maybe even like radio buttons or check boxes, then you kind of fall into this paradigm of the 80-20 rule, where there's a strong likelihood that some preferences will be favorable to users than others, right? And then there's again a strong likelihood that the same 80-20 pattern will be happening there, right? So I would say it really probably depends on the complexity of the data visualization project or environment or platform that you are building, if that makes sense. Great. Yeah, Natalie says there's a lot on Systems 3. Absolutely, it is. There's so much to learn there. All right, there's another question here from Renato. He mentions, I heard about 80-20 rule before, but used on design 20% of the project that will be used 80% of the time. What do you think about it? Yes, I mean, you can certainly, there's different interpretations. And you saw before, we spent 80% of your time using 20% of the apps, right? Which is kind of similar to you doing what you're doing here. And so you could apply this 80-20 rule in a variety of different scenarios. And I prefer this one in the sense that product design is normally comprised of a set of features, right? And there's always a lot of friction about which features to prioritize, which are the ones that are more important. Like you don't want to create this really chaotic type of experience for the user that then we have problems like other principles we have covered before, things like the paradox of choice and Hicks law, right? That are basically all about dealing with complex interfaces. So because product is so often, there's so much friction on what features to select, where to focus, right? And I think 80-20 rule is really all about focus. It's really about identifying that vital few. It's really about focus on what's important. And I'm not saying, of course, the others are not important, but they can quickly fall into this long tail of usage, which, at some point, that's actually the basis of many startups as they grow, for example. And as a mentor, I see this all the time. They kind of put a lot of features out and they learn from that process as users navigate the system, right? And start using some features more than others. And along the way, some of the features are eventually killed. This is, for instance, a process that Amazon is very famously for, right? They try a lot of things, and the things that don't work, there's really no point in maintaining. It just causes delays, right? The system gets really filled with things that are not needed. There's a lot of waste. So sometimes it's just better to unplug things. So that process that product development goes through in terms of identifying the things that are important versus what's not really falls into this idea of the 80-20 rule, right? And identifying the 20% of features and how critical that is from a product standpoint. So hopefully that made sense, Renato. But yes, again, you have to look it up online. There's so many different ways that the 80-20 rule has been applied to so many different scenarios and systems. And I always find quite remarkable how ubiquitous this rule really is. All right, so it seems like we have no more questions at the moment. So if there's no one else wants to ask anything pertaining to the 80-20 rule, I think we can call it quits, and hopefully we can talk a little bit more about other principles in the future. Okay, so again, if you don't follow me here, please follow so that you are notified of future events. I will send you an email after this talking about the forthcoming event, maybe next week. All right, sounds good. Thanks, everyone, and thanks for making time. I always appreciate seeing so many familiar names and faces on these calls. So thank you so much for your time.